Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest, where once again we have a stellar guest for you. Carlos Andres Gomez has very kindly, for festivals such as ours, 2 editions of his biography on his website, carloslive.com. One of them is the short one, and one of them is the long one, and the long one makes for interesting reading. It goes like this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it goes: Carlos Andres Gomez is a Colombian-American poet, speaker, actor, and educator from New York City. He graduated magna cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in history and earned his MFA from the Program for Writers at Warren Wilson College. A former social worker and public school teacher, Carlos co-founded the Excelano Project, one of the nation's premier performance poetry groups at the University of Pennsylvania in 2001. He is the author of Fractures, selected by Natasha Trethewey as the winner of the 2020 Felix Pollock Prize in Poetry, and the memoir, Man Up, Reimagining Modern Manhood, winner of the Atlanta Review International Poetry Prize, the Lucille Clifton Poetry Prize, and the Sandy Crimmins National Prize for Poetry. Gomez's writing appears in many publications, including the New England Review, Beloit Poetry Journal, and Chorus, a literary mixtape. A star of HBO's Def Poetry Jam, TV One's Verses and Flow, and Spike Lee's #1 box office movie, Inside Man with Denzel Washington, Carlos has also recently partnered with John Legend on Senior Orientation, a program to counteract bullying and to champion inclusive masculinity among high school students. If you don't know his work, prepare to be amazed. Sit back, enjoy this ride, because it is my enormous pleasure, honor, and privilege to be able to introduce to the Lockdown LitFest, Carlos Andres Gomez. Carlos, buenos días, ¿cómo está?
Muy bien.
Whereabouts in the...
¿Cómo está usted?
Muy bien, gracias. Whereabouts in the world are we speaking to you from? Because I'm in rural Warwickshire, in the heartland of England, locked down with my 80-year-old father, which is an absolute joy, but you are not.
I am not. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States with my 2 wonderful children and my wife, and taking it day by day, but we're doing pretty well, all things considered.
We're seeing horrible news from all across the world. Can you just give us a quick sit-rep of what it feels like to be in Atlanta, Georgia right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be in Atlanta, Georgia right now, what a time. You know, there's so much changing and shifting, and this, the rising movement of Black Lives Matter again. I think to be at the epicenter of where so much of the organizing and the civil rights movement took place. It's a really, I think in many ways, it's a historic place to be experiencing this moment in time. So, yeah, we've been part of that organizing and part of that movement work, and we will continue.
It has struck me that we are living through a critical time in history, an important time in history, a time that hopefully will resonate and change things for the better, brought about partially by COVID, partially by geopolitics, and also partially by the social politics of land. Does it feel like history in the making where you are?
It does. I mean, I think, in university, in my undergrad, I studied American history. And so I think to be living in a moment where there are so many things that I think are so unique to this moment. I think largely what was put in motion by the pandemic and people being in their houses and many people reconsidering their lives and their careers and so many things. I think that this is a unique opportunity to reimagine and to dream in bold and radical ways about what we want our world to look like. And I really hope that on the other side of the pandemic and on the other side of this ascending movement right now, there is a much healthier, safer, and more equitable world.
Hear, and amen to that. I feel very much, I mean, one of the reasons we set up this festival, all of us who are playing such a role in trying to build this thing, is to provide a stage, to provide a presence, to provide a platform for authors, for writers, and for poets such as yourself, who rely so much on getting out there, being on a stage, performing to live audiences. And I know that I'm going to ask a couple of very difficult things of you, Carlos, which is to perform in your home through a screen to a live audience. And I just want to say before we do that, I commend you for taking this on, because we are living in a time where, fantastic, we have all this technology, but there is nothing that can replace a live audience. It's a roundabout way of me asking you the question, can we start where you started with poetry and where performance poetry became important to you, where you realized the power of words, the artistry of stringing together stringing them together, both largely in text, but also when you figured out, because you are such a powerful performer, about what the power of performance means to you, a poet, and how inspirational it is for you as the poet, as well as we know to audiences.
Well, I'll tell you, when I was 17 years old, and I found poetry as this vehicle that finally allowed me to make sense of so many things I didn't have. I didn't have language around. I didn't have the emotional literacy to be able to touch or make sense of. Poetry became something that was cathartic, that empowered me, that helped me really find my way back to myself. I think after many years of feeling like I didn't have permission to really embrace my most authentic and fullest self. And when I was 17 years old in 1999, I walked into the New Eurekan Poets Cafe and on the Lower East Side of Manhattan for the first time. And to be in that cafe with, 300 and something people, a little 2 by 4 foot creaky stage, a single mic, and a spotlight on a poet, it was something that I never could have imagined that poetry could make possible. It was so far from the way that poetry had been introduced to me in school and in my life. Many of the, canonical traditional poets that I think a lot of people encounter in public school, like I did, and many of them I've rediscovered and appreciate in different ways now. But it was nothing like watching 300 people leap to their feet at the end of 3 minutes, being completely mesmerized in silence, listening to a poet. And I think ever since that fall day in 1999, when I was 17 at the New Eurekan Poets Cafe, to me there is something so distinct about what happens when a poet allows their work to live through their bodies and resonate and echo and reverberate through their chest. I don't know. Every poem I write, I want them to stand up on the page. I want the experience to be unique in what I'm choreographing the reader through. But there is nothing like that moment, that vulnerability, that presentness of sharing yourself in a poem in your body. So for me, I think there's something that is unlocked that is so unique when a room full of strangers share an experience and a poet invites them into their work and into their life through the oral rendering of a poem.
Lem Cisse, our mutual friend, has this wonderful theory that when he's on stage performing, it's the poem that's on stage, not him. He's merely the vector for it. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I love that. I think there is it's so interesting because I've been performing now for a long time, for over 20 years, from that first time when I was 17, the paper shaking so much I could barely read it. And I was so nervous, it's like all the saliva had dried up in my mouth and I could barely even talk, but something, I think, after thousands of repetitions in front of different audiences all over the world, there's this magical thing that happens, I think, with poems now in many instances where I'm in a live performance, whether it's virtual or obviously not right now in rooms with people, but when I was on stage and in front of audiences, where the ego and the self-consciousness that I think was so difficult to quiet or to silence at all for the first 10 years that I performed, is not there in the same way. I think there's a real desire to think of whatever poem I'm allowing to live through my body and offering it to the audience as something that we can all use as an invitation to be present and to be vulnerable and to be alive in this moment together. And I think in that way, it no longer becomes whether it's about me doing the poem or someone else doing the poem. To me, the most exciting part of that whole process is anyone being a catalyst for that kind of connection between strangers. So whether it's me reading the poem or, Paul, like the event that we just did with Lem Cisse and Afra Atish, it's like, whether it's Afra, Lem, or Carlos, whoever it is, I want to be a part of that connection and a part of that celebration of words and of humanity. So for me, when I get up in front of an audience now, right now it's very much through Zoom like this. I'm just excited to be vulnerable and to be genuine and to be present. And it's not about if the poem is right or if all the technical components are there. It's really about being open and being vulnerable and just being present and inviting whoever's listening or watching, say, listen, I want you to come on this journey with me. This is an invitation. I'm putting my hand out for you.
Do you know what? The way you have just expressed that has literally, I'm not kidding, literally given me goosebumps. It's an invitation to be alive, to be present, to be very much in that moment. What a brilliant, brilliant definition of what good poetry does. You've had two poems, at least two poems. What is Genocide? And one that just shakes me every time I read it. Where are you really from? The videos for which, but each of the videos have topped 1 million views. What does that level of presence mean to you? What does that level of acceptance of your words mean to you? Does that inspire, or is it a responsibility?
I think there's a lot of feelings that come along with that. I mean, I don't think anybody, I don't think I've ever put a video online and ever, either one of two things, ever thought 1 million people would ever see anything, or two, taken for granted any single person who sits down to watch my work and appreciate it or listen to it, whatever. I think for me, there's a lot of emotions that come along with that, because when that many people watch it, suddenly it takes on a life of its own. And when I travel places, people know the words, or people feel like they have a connection to me, or it becomes something that enters classrooms or other spaces that I never could have imagined. I think there was a huge responsibility there, because there's a very different kind of, I think, critique or engagement with your work when it's 30 people versus 2 million people. Suddenly, every syllable and every word takes on a different kind of weight and significance, for better or for worse. So I think that knowing that that kind of an audience is a possibility with any poem makes me feel ruthlessly attentive and rigorous about every syllable and every word that I'm making a choice on. And hopefully, that reminds me about the sacred responsibility of any poet and any artist. As my great, former director, for my solo play, used to tell me, the great Tamala Woodard, she would always say to me, this, she said, I'm not, she said she wasn't religious, but she would point at the stage before we were rehearsing and she'd say, this is my church. When you step on this stage, you bring everything and you leave it all on that stage. This is my place where I celebrate and I pray, and this is where my rituals happen. And I think every time I step on a stage, whether literal or figurative like this one, I take it with that seriousness, because, when there are people out there and they find permission to be themselves, or they find a poet who finally has language for something they didn't know how to put into words, I know that's something I found in poems. So I take that very seriously, and hopefully, for the most part, I can honor that with every poem that I put into the world.
I've had the great good fortune to know some extraordinary musicians in my time, including people like Jagger and Freddie Mercury and so on.
Yes.
And the number of them that use the same analogy and say, that stage, that's not just a stage, that's not just boards, that's the altar of performance.
Yes.
The altar of performance, and you owe everything to the audience. I like that a great deal. Carlos, may we please have the first of your poems that you've very graciously agreed to perform for us for Lockdown
Absolutely.
LitFest? Perhaps you'd like to introduce it. You'll do a far better job than I.
Sure. So a lot of my work, for those who may not know my work or those who are just getting to know my work, a lot of my work is reckoning with younger versions of myself, is thinking through and excavating and confronting my life and experiences that I've had. A lot of my work is rooted in autobiography. And in my new book, Fractures, it's all very much autobiographical. It's all very much an unflinching excavation of the internal and external divides that define our world. It reckons with race and gender and sexuality and violence and parenthood. And this poem right here, like a lot of my work, I hope that it's holding as much space for celebration as it does for grieving. This is about me at 15, being out at this all ages dance party in Providence, Rhode Island. And this is called Last Sundays at Bootleggers. And the title comes from this nightclub called Bootleggers in Providence, Rhode Island in the 90s, in the late 90s. And the last Sunday of the month would be an all ages dance party for 13 to 17-year-olds. And I was 15 years old. And this is about that. My entire wardrobe was Canal Street original, knockoff chic, adolescent sleek in my double XL blue and black bubble jacket. Yeah, I was inside the club, and what? Inside an oversized coat coated in sweat and Old Spice. A kid eyeing 16, but not quite there. I wanted it all, Chico. learner's permits, the latest Jordans in baby blue, maybe a wink from the pretty Boricua in social study. And when Biggie's verse dropped in Only You, he was in that room and teaching us how to live elevated. From that third floor wasteland towering above India Point, so we sang, sour-throated and nostalgic, for times we hadn't yet lived in unison, like we wrote it, till our voices cracked and spilled over and between every rift. But in the throng of lost kids, where I finally found a self I loved, it all came together, like we could remix any wreckage and make it into a stage to slay. So we swayed and grinded like our lives were a music video tribute, hip to hip.
Bravo. Carlos Andres Gomez performing his poem last Sunday at Bootleggers. When did you first perform that, Carlos?
Wow, first performed that. That's a great question. I wrote it probably like a year and a half ago, and it's really strange. I mean, a lot of my work is autobiographical, rooted in autobiography and stories from my life. But in living through that poem, there's this strange. It sounds paradoxical, but it's like living in my 15-year-old body with my 38-year-old eyes right now, which creates this kind of interesting tension of this push and pull where I simultaneously am cringing and also celebrating and learning from that younger version of myself. And I think a lot of my work kind of cuts both directions, like a lot of poems, or maybe the poems I'm most drawn toward do. There's the cringe and the cringing and the despair and the I think about the unfinishedness of that version of my adolescent self at that moment in time. But there's also so much that beautiful 15-year-old kid has to teach this father of two right now. And so I don't know, I think in my work I'm often trying to hold space for all that entire landscape of emotion, even when it seems may appear at least to be contradictory.
I like that a lot. We've addressed your first performance. When did you first put pen to paper? When did poetry first figure in your life? When you realized actually there's a way of stringing words together to express emotions, express sentiments, or to just try to nail snapshots of what you're feeling, what you're seeing, what you're living, and that poetry was your way of expressing that. When did those first days start?
So I know the exact day, actually. Okay.
Oh, wow.
The exact day for me was August 8th, 1999. Okay. And the reason I know the exact day is I went to my local Blockbuster Video. I don't know if they ever had Blockbuster Video in England.
Yeah.
Okay. I know the younger generation has no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah,
the youngest. But there was no streaming. There was no Netflix. And I went to my local Blockbuster and there was one copy of this independent film called Slam. And I rented it and I went home and I watched it. And it is this incredible, incredible film starring Saul Williams and Sonia Son. And it's about this poet who is incarcerated, and poetry becomes the way that he finds freedom and kind of transcends the racism and the injustice of the criminal justice system and of the prison system in the United States. And it was the first time I had seen poetry that just felt like it went through my body like lightning. And I watched the film twice in a row, and I wept and I cheered and I laughed and I cried and I felt all these things shifting and moving inside of me. When I finished watching the film for the second time in a row, I for the first time in my life, not for a homework assignment for school, I wrote a poem. And then I wrote another one. And then I wrote another one. And I stayed up until the sun rose writing poems. And I wrote these poems quietly for months until that fall. And then this poet named Martin Espada came to my high school. This great New Yorican poet by the name of Martin Espada. And he read from his book, Imagine the Angels of Bread. And I walked up to him at the end of his performance, and I was so emotional I couldn't even talk. I just could say my name, and he took the copy I just bought from him, and kind of pointed at me, and looked at my eyes like he was seeing deep into who I was, well before I knew the person that I was meant to become. And he signed my book and he wrote, Para Carlos, poeta del futuro, Martín Espada, for Carlos, poet of the future. And he handed me that copy of Imagine the Angels Have Bread. And I think those two watershed moments, first watching Slam that night, August 8th, 1999, and then a few months later that fall, listening to Martín Espada read from his book. After that, I knew that my whole life I had been waiting for this permission to become what I was meant to be, which was a poet. And I think after that, I became obsessive about seeking out spaces where I could connect with other poets and share my work. And shortly after seeing Martín Espada that fall, that's when I went to the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in New York. And I would go to poetry readings in Providence, Rhode Island. And then when I went to college the next year, I would go to readings in Philadelphia. And after that, my life, I think so much of who I was as a person was largely scaffolded by these incredible mentors that I had in these dynamic literary communities. And so many of them are older than me, and they taught me how to be a better writer. But I think in so many ways, they really taught me how to be the man that I should have been, the person that I needed to be. And poetry has been a tremendous catalyst for growth as a person, I think, even more so than as an artist.
It's nice that you pay credit to those who, those who were supporting, those who catalyzed as well. What I also like is that you've never pulled the ladder up after you, but you have really built other ladders beneath you to help others.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
That's the inspiration for the writing. We've talked a little bit about performance, but I did say in the introduction about your role as an actor, not least Spike Lee's #1 box office movie Inside Man, where you work with Denzel. What has acting taught you about performance? And I hate to not spare your blushes, Carlos, but you are a supreme performer. And I think people watching this will realize the quality of breath control, of intonation, of cadence, of meter, of all that voice performance that is so critical in performance poetry. You have nailed down so tightly. And I'm wondering how much of that came from actor training or an ability to understand your presence as it is perceived by others. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, I'll say this. I've studied technique in a lot of different performance realms. I've always been somebody who never wanted to be pigeonholed and be kind of stuck in one particular artistic medium. I know that that's much more, I think, celebrated now. But in the early 2000s, especially, I think there was a lot more tension around that. People would say, okay, you're either a poet who only cares about the page and have no consideration for the audience, or you're a performer and your work cannot be read and have any value. And I think that binary, which I always thought was a false binary and a problematic binary, has really been exploded by so many writers and performers now. But I always say that I think the studying that I've done in other artistic genres makes stronger and sort of, I think, broaden and deepen and complicate and make more dynamic my creative process in other genres. So, for example, I've studied, Harold long-form improv. I've studied, Chekhov, Adler, Meisner technique in acting. I've studied acting for film. I've studied all these different things. I've done theater. I've written as a playwright. I've done voiceovers for video games. I've been a radio host. I've done all these different things. And I would say that all the little tricks and tools and techniques that I picked up through both repetition, but also learning from people who were masters in that realm, I think all of that feeds the other artistic practices. Like, I think even the way that I lineate or format a poem is informed by what I learned about blocking doing solo theater. And I know that may seem strange, but even the way that I think about writing and laying out a poem on a page, I think of it as choreographing the reader's movement through a poem. And there are things that I can do on that page in the kind of theater of that page that I cannot do with my cadence and my performance. In the same way that the way that I lineate a poem or the way that I organize it into stanzas or break the stanzas or move things around, there are things that I can do with my cadence or jokes that I can tell that I can't do in the same way with the way I syntactically organize a poem. So I think for me, embracing all those different dynamic mediums that I operate in, hopefully, I think will strengthen and make more interesting the other mediums that I love to use as vehicles of expression. So I think there's so much that I've learned. I wrote and starred in a solo play that I took to the Edinburgh Fringe in Scotland in 2007 with that great director I told you about, Tamala Woodard.
Yeah.
And I think she taught me so much about what it means to be an artist that can connect and resonate. Not like and taking as much as you can, trying to take the ego away from it and honor the sacred at the heart of this work. And I think in so many ways, though Tamala did help me with the writing, we collaborated, and she was a huge, important person to sort of bounce ideas off of and help in the editing and revision of my solo play. She taught me a lot about writing poetry, even though I think she would tell anybody who would listen that she knows nothing about poetry, but so much that I use as wisdom and knowledge that informs how I write poetry is from Tamala, who's the theater director. So I think hopefully if there's one thing that people take from me who are artists, who are looking for, people always ask me, what advice do you give to writers or performers or anything else? I always say, listen, you have to be curious and in awe of other artistic practices, even ones that you do not operate in. When I watch ballet, I feel goosebumps. When I watch opera or I watch MCs or I watch a B-boy or a B-girl, all that stuff to me is information. Even if I am never going to be a B-boy or I'm never going to be an MC or an opera singer, to me, all of that, every single one of those little things that I'm taking into my body, that is all helping to inform and make more interesting and make more human and meaningful the poem that I'm writing on this page, and then the way that I allow it to live through my body.
That you've just given a masterclass to people on the blocking out of a poem. You're very generous, and we're very grateful, Carlos, I have to say. Would you like to introduce your second work for us, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
This is a short one. This is a short poem, and I spent many years teaching workshops on Rikers Island. That's the infamous, for those who don't know, it's the infamous jail in New York City. More than 17,000 people incarcerated on this little island next to LaGuardia Airport. And I spent much of my time there working with the youngest population that is incarcerated there, and that's 16 and 17-year-old boys. A lot of people don't realize there are literal children that are locked up in this horrific jail on Rikers Island. And this very short poem, it's from my new book, Fractures, and I dedicate this to those 16 and 17-year-old boys. This is called Mourning Rikers Island. Physics and light pierce the hollow stench of the forgotten gymnasium, stripped naked of clocks. All the adolescent boys stop, offer their grief to each other like water, glancing out the only window they all share. A single ray unfolds its warmth across the dusty belly of the thudded parquet. And here's the miracle. The sun frees everyone to sing. Thank you.
Carlos, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I apologize for the bird song in the background. There's a very noisy bird just outside the window.
Oh, I love that. I love when the birds join in and give me some score and give me a chorus underneath. That's perfectly staged.
I hope it isn't a cheap question to ask, but you've worked with Spike Lee and Denzel Washington, two men I admire very greatly. What did you learn from them? What was it like to work with them?
Wow. I think the most exciting thing for me about working with masters of their craft is just watching people's process. Yeah. It's funny, people see celebrity, people work with somebody, they meet somebody and they want to get an autograph or a selfie or, I don't know, whatever. Me, I just want to watch them more than anything prepare to work. That's the most exciting thing for me. I've worked with John Legend and with Savion Glover and with Denzel and with Spike. And I just love to watch how they prepare to work, and the things behind the scenes that I think generally people are not watching or not curious about. As an artist and as a creator, that is the stuff that I'm riveted by. And I think with Denzel, he's a method actor. So while he's on set, he remains in character the whole time. Thankfully, I knew that before we got to set. We did a table reading, before we started shooting. So I talked to him and met him when he was not in character there. But on the set, he stayed in character. He stayed as the detective that he was in Inside Man. So he was a very different person. He was that character the whole time. But watching that commitment to craft, and he did not break that at any moment. It wasn't a joke. It was very, very serious. Watching that commitment to craft, I think, was instructive to me. With Spike, I think the biggest thing about Spike is, my gosh, he's loyal. These are my things I love most about Spike. He's so loyal to his actors and to his crew. I mean, he's had the same crew, I'm saying, across all roles for decades. The same people as his first AD, his second AD, all the way down the line, the same crew that he works with constantly, which I think is so inspiring to me. And the second thing is, he's so open to ideas. He's so collaborative. Anyone could bring up an idea, and Spike will say, "Let's try it. Let's try it." And there was no ego attached to whose idea was the best idea or the idea that ultimately worked. It was constantly a team that he trusted and he admired, and he gave people agency and permission to be a part of that process. And I think that's very much in line with the way that I think of the creative process. It's not about who has whatever stated role. Let's all collaborate and work together, because to me, that's where the most dynamic art emerges, is when there's a whole team collaborating and we just privilege the best idea. It's not about whose idea it is. It's about which idea is the most compelling. And that reminds me too about, Paul, what you said earlier about Lem. It's not about Lem doing the poem. It's about the poem. To me, it's about the work. It's not about the person who gets credit for who created this work. It's about something that we're all working on together.
Nicely put. Tell me how the collaboration with wonderful John Legend came about on senior orientation and this phrase, inclusive masculinity. I'm very intrigued by this, and it's not a phrase I've come across before. Can you enlighten me?
Absolutely. Yeah, John's an incredible person. He's so, he's obviously incredibly talented, but he's so smart, and he's so heartfelt in how he engages with the world and the choices that he makes in his career. He's somebody who really walks the walk, believes what he says, reads incessantly, is supremely well informed. But this project, basically, I got approached about doing a brand collaboration with Axe. And the idea basically was they'd seen my work promoting inclusive masculinity, healthy masculinity. My work has always been championing people being their authentic best selves. But they wanted me to do a project where I worked with high school kids and basically encouraging the kids just to be themselves wherever on the gender continuum they reside, but especially targeted towards adolescent boys in high school, and trying to push back against that culture that promotes so much bullying, where there's this singular one-dimensional idea of what a guy is supposed to act like or supposed to be. And I think a lot of that comes from my memoir. I address this a lot, but I felt very suffocated by a lot of the one-dimensional ideas about masculinity when I was growing up in this very, very machismo culture, where it told me I was not allowed to be an artist or be collaborative or creative or emotional or sensitive or nurturing. Basically it told me I had to be a tough guy who could bench press a certain amount and had to, date a lot of women, So I think for me, they brought me on board to do that. And they pitched this idea to me. Basically, they said, we want you to work we want to bring in like a celebrity artist, because you're both artists. And we want you to mentor some young, senior leaders at a high school. And in trying to build a culture that promotes acceptance, promotes people being their most authentic selves. And I was like, that sounds amazing. And when they brought on John, I thought it was incredible. I admired his artistic work and his greater work in the world. But it's kind of funny because we actually have a lot of connection points. We both went to the University of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. So we actually have some common friends in college. We actually just missed each other, but there were some common people that we know. And we were both in the performing arts at Penn. So there was some, I mean, the world is so small that we had a lot of common people that we knew. And I think both of us feel a lot of passion about that work of trying to dismantle these very restrictive and suffocating ideas that tell men that they can't be, I think, the more gentle and kind and I think emotionally um, aware and present versions of themselves. Although that's changed a lot, I think, definitely in the last decade or so, there's still so many, I think, boys and men who struggle with feeling like they cannot be um, so much of these human qualities that I think all of us want to express. And I think still there's so many cultural norms that say you're not allowed to be the softer and the more sensitive parts of yourself. And me being a poet and artist, I find that, I mean, I can't even fathom a life where I was not allowed to be all those things, which ultimately now as a father and as a husband and as a friend, um, those are the most vital tools for how I can show up in my life. And I know John and I talked about this, I don't know how to be a husband or a father if I wasn't allowed to be nurturing or able to have practice knowing what I'm feeling inside and then being able to express that and navigate that. So yeah, it was a really incredible project. We went to Centennial High School in Columbus, Ohio. We had these incredible mentees, and then the culmination was this big show we did for the whole school, and John and I both performed, and so did our mentees. And yeah, it was incredible. It was an amazing, strange, wonderful collaboration. And who knows? We'll see. Hopefully, another time down the road, I'll get to collaborate again with him. He's amazing.
Black Lives Matter is making a lot of white people uncomfortable and making a lot of people self-check their own privilege. Do you have any words of wisdom or counsel to white guys such as me who are suddenly realizing how fortunate we have been and how unaware we have been of how lucky we are? Do you have anything to say to a white audience?
Yeah, I would say two things, and I'm quoting people. These are not my original ideas. I'm quoting the work of many
Mm.
you know many informed and dynamic change makers, uh, scholars, activists of the African diaspora who've been doing this work for a long time. I know Dr. Kendi, who he wrote "Stand from the Beginning" and
Yeah.
How to Be an Anti-Racist. I know one thing that I heard him saying in this podcast interview with Brene Brown. He's talking about how with racism, it's as though we've been in this like torrential downfall of rain our entire lives, but we can't acknowledge that we're wet. And I think he talks about how racism, in terms of when we're talking about racism as a systemic, institutionally, historically entrenched thing, relies upon denial. And he
Mm.
says the opposite of denial is confession. And I think for me, and this is, I think, very much at the heart of a lot of my work, I think it's reckoning and confronting myself and making sure that as I'm peeling back the layers of what I can do um, as a change agent, as all of us are a change agent, in terms of leveraging the various ways that I can wield power to try to reimagine and dismantle and change the structures that have been so harmful and anti-black in their design for so long. I think so much of what I'm trying to do is face myself and to say, where are the silences? Where are the denials that I've been conditioned to not look at? And I think that gets away from this idea as well of, I think, some of the self-consciousness or some of the reticence that I've seen in a lot of my colleagues and friends that are white or non-black, who are feel a sense of paralysis right now. And I know I've heard a lot of activists say, to move away from perfection and move toward process. It's not about doing this work perfectly because it will have to be messy and imperfect. But to start moving and to start making that work. And I think for me, I'll just say for me, um, being in a relationship where my wife is a black woman and my two children are black and Latinx, um, the immediacy and the urgency of the implications of this conversation for their literal lives um, is so pressing that I can't worry if I'm getting it. Like, of course, I want to do what I'm doing in a meaningful, transformative way. But to be candid, I'm a lot less worried about getting the work wrong or doing it imperfectly, and more about trying to get in that process and try to shift the structures and the world as we have known it for so long. Because quite literally, my wife and my children and my nephews and nieces and my in-laws and my best friend from high school and so many people I love and beyond, their lives depend on it. So I think my biggest thing would be, listen, the work is messy and it's painful and it's complex, but remember, whatever feelings you may be present with, there are structures that are literally killing people slowly and quickly at a traffic stop, and slowly because my wife gets 4 or 5 less minutes with her primary care physician because of implicit bias, which might mean they overlook a diagnosis that may save her life. And so I think being present and centering the implications of the white supremacist structures that have been in place for so long by design, rather than the messy, complicated feelings that, you know, anyone who's white or non-black like me may be feeling, and say, listen, let's keep our eye on the horizon about what this work is really about. And I think that's a way of, I think, decentering some of the things that can ultimately be really counterproductive to the work. Because, spoiler alert, we're going to get it wrong. You know what I mean? I get it wrong all the time.
Yeah.
But I feel so urgent about the world that my kids, when they finally have their driver's license and they take the car out for the night without me,
Mm.
I don't want to accept that they're going to live in the same world that we know right now. I need a different world to be possible. And every day I wake up, I want to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to make that dream real.
Well put. I'm slightly confused, Carlos. You said you got a new book out called Fracture. I'm aware there's a book called Hijito, which is out. Is this the same book with a different title, or are these two different books?
No, that's a fantastic question. So, Ijito is a chapbook. It's about a third of a much larger vision that will be released this fall. So, Ijito came out last September, was released by the incredible independent press,
Yeah.
Platypus Press in England. Did an amazing release at the Poetry Cafe in London with Raymond Antrobus in December. So much love to so many writers and also supporters in the UK. But this was a chapbook, and my debut full length collection, Fractures, will be released this fall, October 13th, through the University of Wisconsin Press. So, for those of you who have Ijito or who have read Ijito, think of that as a little peek into a larger vision. And Fractures is, I think, the book that I've been waiting to put into the world since I first fell in love with poetry nearly 21 years ago. And I've never been more excited. I've never put more work. I've never put more vulnerability in any project. So I'm both terrified and thrilled to see Fractures in the world soon.
That's a good place for any artist to be, terrified and thrilled, Carlos. That's the best place. Excuse me. May I ask you, do you have one final poem to close our show with?
Absolutely.
Please,
Absolutely.
if you would, Carlos.
Thank you. This final poem, I think, is very timely for this moment in time that we're in. Um, I think both with all the shutdowns and the pandemic, I think with this critical moment of resistance and movement across the world, with thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think a moment of overwhelming anguish and rage and terror, but also hope and change and shifting and flux. Uh, this poem, I think, is a reminder that I wrote to myself. It's in the new book, and it's a reminder about reaching toward gratitude, even on the most difficult of days, even when despair feels like um, the only thing that we can know. And this is called praise. Praise. Because my grandmother's final days lasted 23 years. And so we'd rush each time. Say goodbye and goodbye. Te quiero mucho, abuelita. Te adoro. Because my mother's truest mother is grief, who taught her the slack-jawed abandon of joy. Because my daughter strung together a 4-syllable word this afternoon. Because I say I love you so much to my wife mid-fight. And we chuckle sometimes between barbs like we forgot which characters we were supposed to play, because I was given a best friend for all of 6 years. And we handwrote letters each week in bright ink, dreamed of whose hair would give way first. Because the dust gave me a reprieve from the storm on the way home from daycare today. Because the rain is a stubborn guard when I am most tired. And grace refuses the chariots, also known as that rickety stroller that has somehow not yet quit, because Brent's metamorphoses those ticking minutes everyone else loses sleep over, shows up an hour early, or makes me wait while I reread the menu I've had memorized for a decade, because we pretend we don't know what we'll order, ask each other, then get the chicken pad thai every damn time, because my sister and brother were once small enough to make a home of my curled arm. Because I loathed their arrival until that moment on the 7th floor of Mount Sinai, because there are no half siblings. Because my body begins to fail a little more each morning in minute and quiet increments, like gradual, gorgeous rust. Because I courted death too long, but now dream of my retirement porch. Because my son's scalp is 76 seconds old. The 3 weeks he barely slept for more than 15 minutes. The lunges that shaped my quads and calmed his sobbing just long enough, because I have wanted to be a father as long as I have feared its weight. Because I exhale knowing I cannot fail what I cannot leave, because no one I know has grown more in 3 decades than my father. Because right now, the oven is performing its miracles. July is teasing us with its relentless warmth. My daughter is coloring in vibrant looping scrolls that look like cartoon fireworks, or the curls wreathing the large eyes she's borrowed from her mother. And finally, I'm home. Thank you
Carlos, thank you.
so much, Paul.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming to join us, Carlos. Thank you so much for fantastic words, and thank you so much for performing for us. You have actually brought me to tears. I do apologize. It's been such a pleasure. Very good luck with the book. We will flag it up. We will try and get orders for you. We will try and get people to buy it. We'll support you through social media, as we do. We have a very fantastic team. I get to be on this stage, but believe you me, there are some very committed people behind this virtual screen who I think will be very, very, very pleased that we have had you here on the Lockdown LitFest. Carlos Andres Gomez, thank you so much.
Such a joy, Paul. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Carlos Andres Gomez. If you haven't come across his work by now, now's the time. He has a fantastic website, carloslive.com. You'll find a lot of his work up there. You'll find a lot of his videos up there. You'll find a lot of his friends up there. He's done stuff. He's leading from the front. And by God, he has the means to communicate it. Thank you so much for joining us. As ever, from the Lockdown LitFest, please keep well, please stay safe, and please be careful, and love the people that love you back. Cheerio.